So I'm going to be speaking this morning about Joseph, and specifically Joseph as a survivor of family trauma. And so partly I'm going to be talking about Joseph, but partly also I'm going to be talking about a question that came up in my Old Testament course this semester. And we broke out into small groups on Zoom, and one of the groups came back with an anonymous question for the professor, and that question was, why read the Old Testament when it's so traumatic and there's so many other more edifying things to read? And this question really bothered me, and it bothered me in a couple ways. I think one way was that I part of me was like, what are you doing in seminary? And you don't even value the Old Testament. And then another part of me was, it just sort of like lodged in my heart and became a part of how I was reading. And it became a part of how I was, a question that I was asking when I was studying. And I realized that we're all kind of dealing with that question on some level in terms of, as we read traumatic stories in succession in this course, it's hard not to sometimes recoil from the trauma, or to sort of know how to make space for it. So even for those of us like myself who really do love the Old Testament, there's also still that question of how do I make sense of these traumatic incidents in a way that doesn't gloss over them, in a way that that doesn't ignore them, and in a way that's healing. So that question became as much a part of this message as Joseph's story. And I was thinking about how on reality TV shows, very often candidates on the show will say, I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to win. And I don't know if you've ever seen, but people have made viral videos of just, person after person from show after show repeating that same line about like, I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to win. And I was thinking about how I think sometimes we approach the Bible, or at least many of us grew up maybe in Sunday school with an approach to the Bible where it was like looking for God's hero in the story, and looking for who we could make ourselves more like, who's the good person who's doing the good thing that God wants, and kind of like how to use the Bible to like win at life and be on the right team. And how the problem with that, I mean, there's so many ripple effects of that kind of approach. I think the biggest being that when your reading is so goal oriented, right, you lose some of the well, certainly you lose humanity within that. So I was thinking about how even in seminary, I think many people have sort of matured beyond that type of reading, that sort of simplistic looking for good guys reading, but it still comes up in the ways that we want to win. We want to use the Bible to win theological arguments, and so we approach it from that perspective, and then it becomes like a counter narrative to whatever we may have been exposed to that we're trying to counter, and how all of that is kind of like that reality TV show conflict narrative. And I took courses in conflict theory at Portland State, and I learned a couple things about conflict narratives. One of them was about how the truth is obscured when there's a conflict situation, how the truth gets lost. Because what happened as people distance themselves from one another in what happened from their enemy, what actually happened becomes like, well, I can't, I don't want anything that I say to sound like I'm acknowledging that what that person is saying is true. So I will take a step back this way with my narrative and say, no, it wasn't like that. It was like this. And then the other side does the same thing. And so what actually happened becomes separated into two divergent paths. And no longer can the two conflicted groups even agree about the basic facts of what happened, let alone the sort of interpretation and meaning. So, and it's similar on a reality TV show when someone says, I mean, obviously reality TV shows are not really what we're trying to base our life on. But I do think that there's something about that line and how it just repeats itself. That's like so much a part of it's a meme of our culture, right? Of, I'm not here to make friends, I'm here to win. And, when they say that they're about to do something probably not very Christ-like on the TV show, like there's always sort of like, that's the signal, like, this person's going to do something that is kind of dirty. And so the other thing that I learned in conflict theory that I felt relevant to this situation was about the good, the bad, and the tragic. And that's that in a conflict narrative situation, you end up having good guys and bad guys. And of course, on one side, someone will say, I was the good guy and my opponent was the bad guy. But on the other side, it will be the polar opposite, reverse of that. And there's often no way to come to any sort of common understanding or to resolve the sort of pain and hurt that's been done, as long as those good and bad characters persist. But as soon as you can sort of soften and view people as tragic, which is really the more truthful thing in conflict situations very often, then it becomes easier to sort of account for the traumas that have happened and to sort of see the truth. So I brought that trauma. I was thinking through the trauma narrative thing and how that's sort of coming up in this course. And I was also thinking about the things that I learned from Quakers about approaching the Bible, and specifically the work of Vale Palmer's, who was a good friend of some people in this meeting. And some of you may not have heard of him and may not realize that he just recently passed away, but he was the author of this book and several other books exploring how Quakers have traditionally approached the Bible. And so he taught me to sort of approach the Bible with love. He and Quakers, his argument is that Quakers have this tradition of approaching the Bible with love, approaching the Bible as a place to make friends, and that love is listening. So if we're approaching the Bible empathetically, as he says, if we're approaching these biblical figures empathetically, these people who are tragic and in these traumatic situations, then can we just listen without judging those individuals so harshly? And so with this study, I guess I have taken that approach and tried to approach the Old Testament this term with the idea of like the reverse of the reality TV show approach of showing up at the Battle of Jericho or these different situations and saying, I'm not here to win, I'm here to make friends. And rather than needing to settle arguments or come to conclusions about these stories all the time, to try to really listen to the people who are a part of this, who are traumatized people who are enacting traumas on one another personally and interpersonally and intergenerationally and among people groups. And instead of judging their experience and their world, to just listen and approach them as a friend, and maybe as the way I would approach a person who's a war refugee, where I would say, oh, you know, I can't imagine what it must have been like for you to go through that. And I might not always agree with that person's interpretation of what happened. But I can sort of listen to them with the same respect and love that I do to people in my meeting who are all of you who are also traumatized and people who've enacted traumas oftentimes. And in social work, there's been a big move away from the sort of older models that tended to judge people's behavior as wrong, to judge people for their social position, and towards, you know, a trauma-informed model of care. A trauma-informed model of care being where you approach people as, instead of what's wrong with you, approaching people as what's happened to you. And so I wanted to approach the text that way, and the individuals within the text that way, especially with some of these texts that we've been reading that are more difficult. I chose to work with Joseph for this message, and I don't think Joseph is the most difficult. I think Joseph is somewhat low-hanging fruit as the Old Testament goes. He's somewhat easy to like and easy to understand. But I chose Joseph because I think that he does have a particularly interesting story in regards to his relationship to trauma. So to recap Joseph's story, if you're not very familiar with it, I'm going to do that quickly because it's a very long narrative in the Bible, and it kind of goes a lot of different places and is quite detailed. And I think we can get lost in a lot of those different details. It's a very plotty story. We can get lost in the plot, but that's not the approach that I wanted to take this morning. I feel a leading to approach this as looking for what the story says about the people of God's experience with trauma, how Joseph engaged with that trauma, and what we may be able to learn from that. So Joseph was a shepherd. He's the son of Jacob. He's the youngest son, and the texts tell us that he was Jacob's favorite son. And because he was his favorite son, and also because he has a very positive attitude, and also has a lot of dreams, and because of the content of his dreams, which are considered prophetic dreams, his brothers really hate him. And so his brothers actually plot to murder him. They end up not going through with the murder because one of them stands in the way. They do go through with throwing him into a pit with the intention of just leaving him there to die, with only one brother who's secretly planning to come back and rescue him. But that doesn't come to pass because some traders come along and his brothers sell him into slavery. He's taken to Egypt, where he does well as a slave. He sort of, by his ingenuity, rises through the ranks and is very well respected by his. He's doing well in his household, and then another bad thing happens to him, which is that the wife of his master decides that she has a thing for him. She tries to seduce him. He refuses her advances because he's not an idiot, and she frames him for rape out of revenge, which is a crime, which means that he goes to prison, and he finds himself in prison. And there in prison, he meets several other prisoners who have fallen on bad luck, who used to work for the Pharaoh, who the Pharaoh was unhappy with. We don't know why. And he ends up interpreting their dreams. And because his interpretations of dreams are his spiritual gift and are prophetic, the predictions end up being correct. And one of them, he predicts that he'll go back to work for the Pharaoh again. He said, and Joseph says to him, when this comes true, remember me and mention my name to the Pharaoh. But he doesn't remember his name. He forgets as soon as he's doing well. He forgets Joseph and what Joseph did for him. But then the Pharaoh has a series of very disturbing dreams, and no one can interpret the dreams. And the Pharaoh is lamenting about this. And the servant tells him, I know somebody who can interpret dreams, who I met in prison. And they bring him out of prison. He is able to interpret the Pharaoh's dreams, which predict 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine in Egypt. And because of his predictions, Egypt is able to protect itself and prepare for what's to come. And he's rewarded for his good service and does quite well and ends up in the most powerful position under the Pharaoh. Many years pass by. His brothers come back to Egypt, not knowing that he's there. They come back to ask to purchase food, and he's now in the position to be selling food. They're experiencing famine, so they have to leave their land and get food in Egypt. And unknowingly, they come before their brother. Joseph doesn't reveal himself initially. He kind of plays a trick on his brother to teach them a lesson. But eventually he does reveal himself, and his brothers are afraid that he will do something terrible to them. But what's probably the most surprising moment in this story, which is full of surprises, I think, is just that Joseph decides to just receive them with joy and forgiveness. And everything seems very happy. And he says to them, you intended harm against me, but God intended this for good. And so he decides his brothers are ready to, at one point, to become slaves, to sort of, as restitution for what they've done. And he pardons them and says, no, that's not necessary. So with all of the things going on in this story, a couple things that I want to call attention to. Two motifs of trauma that kind of replay throughout the story. And why I think these motifs of generational trauma are important is because I think that they tell us that the writer of this book was aware of the cyclical nature of trauma and how violence was being enacted again and again. The first one is just the motif of sibling rivalry, as my Bible commentary called it, although I really kind of objected to that framing because, I mean, we're talking about his brothers plotted to murder him, and, attempted it and probably were very brutal and sold him into slavery. So it's kind of, I think that sibling rivalry is not the terminology that I would choose. I would I would choose the language of family violence and call it what it is and say that was a real part of his experience. I think we can obscure the sort of traumatic nature of some of this stuff as we look back on it as a fairy tale or things like that. But these are real things that people experienced in the ancient world that was a very traumatic place where a lot of people were, I would say trauma was probably the norm for most people. So that motif comes up numerous times throughout these like 13 chapters as sort of like it's sort of mirroring, it's sort of like a literary play where there's more than one set of siblings who are jealous of one another. And that harkens back to another, set and things like that. The other thing that comes up though is the trauma of enslavement, which is a little bit more obscure in how it comes up. The traders who come along are Midianite and Ishmaelite traders, and that means that they are descendants of the slave wives of Joseph's ancestors. So Joseph's ancestors of Abraham had numerous wives, and two of his slave wives went on to be the ancestors of the Midianites and the Ishmaelites. So it's interesting how we see slavery of one people, and then he's being enslaved by the people that his ancestors have once enslaved. Again, that comes up just with Joseph's enslavement in Egypt, which actually sort of foreshadows what's going to happen in the future of that the whole people of God are going to end up, the Israelites are going to end up being enslaved in Egypt in the next book of the Bible in Exodus. And Joseph's story ends just before Exodus, bridging into Exodus. Interestingly, even though this darkness is on the horizon and is foreshadowed by Joseph's story, Joseph is still very positive. He feels that he is a part of God's promise, and that's kind of all he seems to see. So I also think it's apparent that Joseph, as a person, was aware of the cyclical nature of trauma and how this was being reenacted over generations. I think he's aware of that because he gives his two sons, names that have to do with that. The first son he names Manasseh, which is means making to forget in Hebrew. So he says he names his son that, for my God has made me to forget all my hardship in my father's house. And then his second son Ephraim he names, which the name means to be fruitful. And he says, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my oppression. So I think in naming his sons these things, he's clearly he's drawing a line between that this trauma he wants to end and he sees his children as the hope of that ending. He sees himself as the bridge to the future generations. The second way that I think that Joseph clearly demonstrates his awareness of this is just with the forgiveness of his others, and that part of this, the second time that he forgives them occurs when he's very old and about to die. And he says, even though I'm about to die, God will surely come to you and bring you up out of this land. So even though he's not going to personally experience being a part of this promised land, which is kind of that's the promise that he's envisioning, he sees himself and his own life as necessary for bringing about that promise. So I think of Joseph as a very resilient person, and that's why he became interesting to me as far as thinking about trauma within the Bible. I don't want to present that in a moralistic way, because I don't think that being resilient is better than not being resilient in a moral sense. I think that it's probably, in the case of Joseph, more something that was an accident of his psychology and how he was the circumstances he was born into. But I do think it's very relevant. And in part of my empathetic exegesis was doing a lot of napping, because I was really hoping that it's kind of like method acting, where you just sort of, I was trying to get into the Joseph sort of spirit, and I was hoping that maybe God would give me dreams, and I was asking God to give me dreams, which I was hoping, would be a good method for writing sermons. And God did give me a dream. And in this dream, was Joseph's bones. And it was like a dry bone, like you find in the woods from a deer or something like that. And my friend was asking God, why did you bring this bone forward, like through all these generations? What good is this bone to us? And God showed me that inside the bone was living bone marrow and stem cells, which carried the capacity for healing that we need now. So that is my Joseph dream, and my interpretation of my Joseph dream has to do with what that bone marrow is, which is that I think in the case of Joseph has to do with what makes him a resilient person. And we need that resilience, because we also are living in traumatic times. We may look at the way things were in ancient times and think that things are so much better now. And in some ways that might be true, but also, there was a groundbreaking study 20 or 30 years ago that was all of white middle-class Americans, 17,000 people looking at trauma in childhood. And what they found out was the shocking revelation that trauma in childhood is very common. And not only is it very common and normal, but in fact, it's one of the leading causes of death of people. So we are in need of healing from this. And I think if we're to approach these figures from the Old Testament as our friends, we can approach them also as like, you guys are really the experts on this trauma stuff, I think, because I think certainly the amount and frequency of traumatic events that they were living was probably in excess of what we experience now. And we know that resilience is a factor that protects people from the health impacts of trauma. It's a factor that protects people spiritually and physically and emotionally from some of the damage that trauma can do. So it's not a morally better way to be, but it is a safer and healthier way to be. And I think what made Joseph such a resilient person is that, number one, I think that he never let go of the knowledge that he was a beloved child. I think that Joseph was born into that sense of being surrounded by his father's love, and he never felt apart from that. So even though horrible events would befall him that were traumatic, he was able to know that he was beloved within that experience. And very often we don't. I think that I didn't grow up knowing that I was loved, and I experienced knowing that I'm loved through God. And I don't know how to convey that experience to somebody who doesn't experience that. I don't think that words are sufficient, but I will testify and am here to say that if you don't know this already, you are a beloved child of God, no matter what has happened in your life, no matter what befalls you. The second thing that I think Joseph knew was that he knew that he was an ancestor. So he thought of his life as being a part of this family of God, this fulfillment of God's promises through many generations. So even though he lived quite traumatic, much of his life was taken up by a series of traumatic events, he was able to forgive those things, even to forgive his brothers without really needing to trust their sincerity of their apology. I personally question the sincerity of their apology at that moment when it occurs, but whether or not they really had, they were just trying to save their butts, or if they really were repentant, we don't know. In any case, it seems that Joseph had the desire to forgive, partly as a gift to future generations, because he saw his life as a gift to future generations. You can imagine things having gone in a very different way, and it does in many of the stories that we have, of the ancestral stories that we have. He might have just said, "Hey, slit their throats. These are my brothers." You can kind of imagine a dramatic confrontation and murdering all the brothers, but that's not what happened. And I think that was partly because of his intention, which he indicated with the naming of his son. Thirdly, I think the other thing that made Joseph resilient was, I think that, and this is, I think, another thing that is just like knowing that you're an ancestor was very much a part of the consciousness, I think, in this time, in the ancient world, in this family. And we know that because we still have the genealogy as part of our sacred text. That Joseph, similarly, I think it was a part of the ancient mind to not see events as separate from God, to just view God, to accept God's omnipotence as sort of a fact of life. And sometimes I think that played out in ways that we then have to sort of sort through and reckon with now, because we've got texts where it's like, I mean, I guess at the most simplistic level, it comes across like, if something bad happens to you, that's because God is angry with you. And if something good happens to you, that's because you did something to please God. And the problem with that, and why it's difficult for many of us to accept, is because if we've experienced trauma, that puts God in the position as like abuser. And that's not the only way I think that ancient people interpreted these things, but I do think that they were unable to separate the events from God. So there are other ways that looks at different times. I think the modern mind wants to just remove God from anything that's traumatic. So I think we have a way of saying anything bad that befalls us, God has nothing to do with that, because God wouldn't want something bad to happen to me. And the problem with that is that it means that it can be difficult to find God when we're in the midst of those difficult experiences. It can actually seem to us like God doesn't exist and God isn't with us, or we can't see how, and we can't reconcile those things. But what I hear in what Joseph says to his brothers about, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, is a different type of an omnipotence. I don't hear him saying, God intended for me to be abused so that these things could occur. But I do hear him saying, God intended to use this experience to bring about his promise of goodness for future generations and for everyone. So he believes deeply in God's desire to reconcile. And he also believes deeply in, I guess what I'm calling God's omni-creativity, that God can take anything, any sort of circumstance, good, bad, and ugly, and sort of shape that into a promise. And I think that Joseph's tremendous faith in that omni-creativity gave him a very powerful sort of resilience that not all figures in the Old Testament have, certainly. So those were the things that my friend Joseph shared with me about this story. And the queries that I have for today relate to that. There's an option of 4 different queries. I'm putting them in the chat for you right now. First, in relationship to scripture, if you feel led to meditate on that, do I approach the Bible as a place to make friends? And how does this change my reading? 2, when I encounter traumas, do I still know that I'm a beloved child of God? 3, do I see my life as a gift to future generations and as a part of God's promise? And 4, what if it is true that God is present and all creative in everything I experience, even traumatic events? What does that make possible?